Hey everybody, I'm Steve Moore.
And I'm Mark Castleman.
We know the pain and heartbreak of porn and sex addiction.
And we know the triumph of breaking completely free.
Every day, we help our clients find hope and healing.
Join us in the fight to take back your life, your marriage, and be stronger than ever.
This is the PBSC Squared podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to the PBSC podcast. Mark and Steve coming at you with episode 256 today. Which I think technically speaking, like mathematically, this is exactly, let's see, 256. Oh wait, no, is that right? Yeah, that's exactly 3 years of episodes, 52 weeks.
Oh, exactly. Oh yeah, you're right. That is exactly.
Which is weird. I don't know how we have bonus extra credit episodes. I'm not sure how that happened. Maybe it was leap year or something, but anyway. Yeah, so exactly 3 years of episodes. So it's great to be with all of you today. Got a good topic today, and this did not come to us from a submission. This actually just came out of our brains as we were kind of considering, what we've been working on in Dare to Connect with people recently, what's been happening with our client bases. And as we were considering that, one thing that came to mind was this idea of partners and what we could say. I mean, you can see it in the title. Why do I go silent as the partner of a sex addict, and how do I healthily break free? What we see too many partners do, which we would term, suffering in silence, I guess is a good way to put it, right?
Mm-hmm.
The loss of that authentic voice, that voice going away, being snuffed out, sometimes never being cultivated. And we wanted to talk about that today, that dynamic, how that happens, why that happens, and where that comes from, but also help to empower. We want partners to be able to walk away, and addicts who listen to this as well to understand the process. But for partners, anyone who's listening to this, we really want to set you off in a healthy way onto a journey, or push you further along your journey in either discovering for the first time or recapturing your voice. Because one of the most common things that we see with the partners that we work with is this silencing that comes about through lots of different ways and means.
Well, the last month we've been talking about in Dare to Connect what we call defense mechanisms.
Yeah.
Some people call it getting defensive, but what we've been talking about is we come up with all sorts of ways growing up and over a lifetime to defend ourselves from things that are dangerous, not safe, betrayal, abuse, trauma, all the things that happen. And we learn to defend ourselves. And I know, having grown up in an abusive home where I suffered abuse and trauma in some really deep, significant ways, one of the ways that I learned to stay safe was to go silent, to go along to get along, to be a people pleaser, to just don't say anything, and the chances of you getting hurt diminish.
Mm.
And I carried that tried and true defense mechanism into my adult life, and really lost my voice. In some ways, I never had one. Maybe I had one when I was a little tiny kid, but I think I lost it really quick. And Steve, you and I work with a lot of partners over these 20 plus years, where sometimes I was going to try to think if it was a lot of the time, some of the time, most of the time, where we'll work with partners who don't feel like they even ever had a voice. It's not about getting it back. It's like, did I even ever have one?
Yeah.
Really terribly traumatic backgrounds, or they've lost it. They really have lost it in this relationship with this porn or sex addict. So very common to see this.
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree. Well, and it happens for lots of reasons, right? And furthermore, before we can get into that, it can take lots of forms. Right.
Mm-hmm.
There's of course the kind of the obvious where somebody due to upbringing, and we'll talk about that in a second, or other circumstances, never was taught how to find their voice.
Mm-hmm.
But the other kind of common side that partners oftentimes see is from a caretaking role or from a people pleasing role or trying to keep the peace or just survive, really. Partners can this can oftentimes happen. And then the other one that I guess you could also add in the more common category would be the withholding or not sharing of unpleasant information or feelings, to keep him happy or again to people please or whatever. But there's kind of a nefarious, I guess you could say, almost underbelly that I want to make sure we touch on as well and recognize, and that would be the allowing of shame or low self worth, other distorted paradigms that we've been taught through experience or otherwise that give permission to living in that lifestyle okay or acceptable or healthy,
Yeah.
right? Where it's one thing for this to come about as a survival mechanism, and that's traumatic and destructive all on its own, but that deeper, like this is not only not bad, this is the way I should be living, right? This is the
Right.
way this is it's giving permission to this terribly dysfunctional, destructive, very unhealthy, toxic, and mentally damaging behavior. Um,
Yeah, and sometimes that it's not only okay but preferable comes clear back from childhood. This well, the old statements, kids are better seen and not heard, right? We see that pervasive in some of the culture. So you're right, where it's actually just assumed, expected. Yeah, you don't have a voice. That's the way it's supposed to be.
mhm.
Yeah, which is absolutely false.
Yeah. And so we definitely wanted to address this today and talk about kind of the origins, and that's where we're going to start with that. And we'll talk about kind of the opposite of this and what the healthiness looks like as we sort of go along. So let's talk. Why does this happen? Where does this even come from? And let's just start at the beginning. Let's start with family of origin. Um, for many people, and I would throw myself in this category, not as a partner of an addict, obviously, but I grew up in a household where, and I'm not sure how it happened because it wasn't what the statement I'm going to make is not totalitarian. I don't want to portray. I grew up in a household where, in certain settings, I was taught that it was okay and healthy to vocalize needs. But somewhere along the line, and I've seen this with my siblings as well, somewhere along the line, me and they, and I think there are multiple sources for it. We learned somewhere along the line that in certain situations and scenarios, your needs don't matter, right? What you want or what you need or what is important for you, you just set that aside and you truck along.
Hmm.
And I can understand there how there was a healthy version of that where maybe sometimes I need to set aside needs temporarily or collaborate with somebody. But somewhere along the lines, I and again my siblings, we kind of got the message that because I've noticed in certain situations we will go silent, we will not express things, and that frankly has caused a lot of issues, even in family dynamics today, where needs have been sublimated, undermined, dismissed for years, and they're just now coming out and being expressed, and it's causing problems. So,
Well, and what you're saying, Steve, and this certainly applies to any, betrayed partners listening who are in a culture with a dysfunctional addict. It might be okay for you to have a voice as a partner as long as it's in a happy conversation or it's saying things that the addict wants to hear. Right. Certain circumstances say you can have a voice, but as soon as those circumstances change, where you're being too honest, or you've stepped out of line now, or you're saying what needs to be heard, not wants to be heard. Right? We saw a lot of those conditions as we were being raised. It wasn't that you never had a voice, but boy, you could have a voice in certain circumstances and you couldn't have one in others. And we certainly see that the case with partners who are in a relationship with an addict. So that happens. Family of origin, relationships of origin. But one of the things we listed were institutions. What did we
mhm.
learn in schooling? What did we learn in religious institutions? What did we learn in certain you know situations with peers? Public settings. All sorts of rules about who gets to have a voice, who gets to be heard, who doesn't. A lot of that was etched into us.
Well, I think a lot of that breakdown, I mean, if we were to, because I could give examples of both the schooling piece as well as the religious piece. I mean, I won't give the name of the school, but in my graduate program and my, journey to become a social worker, become therapist, I won't lie. I had some professors that sucked. And I remember, I think I understand to a degree what they were trying to teach, but I had several professors in my graduate program who literally would guilt trip entire classrooms of people saying, if you go into private practice as a result of this and you don't just stay like a social worker working in really at need populations and poor demographics or whatever the case is, you're selfish and you're doing this wrong. If you
Mm,
work with anybody other than that, uh, and the irony was these wingnuts that were teaching this stuff, half of them had private practices. But they would teach those kinds of things and really shame that. Hey, your wants don't matter.
right.
You're going to school, you're paying all this money, you're putting all this work in. Guess what? It's not for you. You're here to do stuff for other people. Terribly toxic, terribly
Yeah.
destructive. We've
Yeah.
seen the same things play out in religious institutions. Again, not demonizing institutions. It's a rare day when I've ever come across a religious institution that, like on a core doctrinal level, teaches these kinds of things. Where we see this oftentimes come up is in the cultural manifestation of things,
Yes.
right? So, for example, like concepts like service. I was raised in a household where the idea was to serve and to sacrifice for other people. Guess how that can easily be twisted? One person's sacrifice becomes another person's your needs don't matter, kill yourself for everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And there's
Mm-hmm.
a balance that can be struck there that's healthy. There's
There
a
is.
toxic version of that that absolutely feeds into what we're talking about here today.
Yeah.
And so those are that's one example from each of those where that they can be culprits in this.
Another one that's very much often the case is traumatic experiences. Where you learned from painful experience that it's not safe to open your mouth. And so when you're in a situation where you would find your voice or speak your truth, past traumas will shut you down.
Yeah.
That's very common. And various kinds of triggers, trauma triggers will do that. And then of course, see this last one, which is very much what we're talking about today. What happens when you're in a relationship with colleagues in the workplace, friends, extended family, or a romantic partner or a marriage partner? What happens when gaslighting and manipulation takes place in any of those relationships? What
Mm.
happens to your voice? Right? You're crazy for saying these things, or you're the one that's at fault, or this is you, and your words get twisted, or you're faulted for a word, or right, all of this twisting and gaslighting and manipulating that can happen in these relationships where you just learned that it's just safer to just shut up.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Well, and last but not least on this list, and it is a form of trauma, but the gaslighting or manipulation that can happen in relationships right over
Yep.
time.
Yep.
So that can happen with, obviously, we talked about family of origin already, those early years, but it's not limited to that by any means, right? This kind of thing can happen with colleagues, friends, or romantic partners,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And that romantic partners can't be underestimated. Many of you partners listening to this learned a lot of what we're talking about today in terms of that struggle or this struggle with self-worth through the action, inaction, statements, lack of statements, silent treatment, other forms of manipulation and or emotional abuse that was perpetuated by your addict partner. That's
Yep.
just the reality. It's not pleasant, but it's true.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
so those are all very, common sources. Now, understanding sources is important because that paired with why these things are problematic help begin to point towards solutions.
Mm.
So let's talk about why this is problematic because some of I think everybody listening to this podcast can probably identify at least some ways in which this is problematic. But it is important to understand the full scope of what is going on when a partner finds themselves in a dynamic like this, or frankly, anyone because addicts struggle with this in different ways as well,
Sure.
right? This is not just unique to
Sure.
partners. Many addicts struggle with internalized shame that came from these same sources. So this podcast is very relevant to addicts listening as well.
Well, and as we something just occurred to me, Steve, as we start into these specific elements of why this is a problem. One of the things that jumps out to me, and you and I talk about this in our Dare to Connect program all the time, not with addicts in recovery, but very much with partners. One of the things that we have seem to have a big radar screen for you and me is whenever we see someone who is for whatever reason, being forced to, or from long habit, or it's not safe, or what have you, communicating and expressing in a way that is not authentic to that person, right? For whatever reason, they don't feel that they can actually be themselves and speak their true voice. It's not authentic.
Yeah.
And so these specific things we're about to talk about are all kind of subcategories of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. Hey, everybody. It's your PBSC podcast co-host here, Mark and Steve, with a special message to all of you about our revolutionary recovery program for addicts, spouses, and couples, Dare to Connect. Nearly every day, we receive messages from subscribers in the program, couples who are just like you, trying to heal from the devastating effects of sex addiction, pornography addiction, and betrayal trauma. Recently, we actually received an amazing feedback message of hope from a current D2C subscriber, and we wanted to just share it with you quickly. She says, this is a partner. I am grateful that while you fully address this addiction as a disease and that it takes over the addict's life, you both also fully address the impact their behaviors and their betrayals have had on the partner. Your words and teachings on partner betrayal trauma opened my husband's eyes to his responsibilities and role in helping me heal. He has stepped fully into the gap to lead this process, and we are making such progress. I originally started D2C by myself as my addict partner was not interested in anything I had to say about recovery. He was working recovery through another program, but his work was off limits to me. I had listened to so many of your PBSC podcasts, and I realized that I needed more than I was getting through my own support group. So I signed up for the Dare to Connect 2-week trial.
And then she continues. She says, one night, my husband looked over my shoulder and asked what I was doing. I shared Dare to Connect with him. He tried it, and he's been fully engaged ever since. Steve and Mark's knowledge and experience speak to him, and he has implemented so many of the things that have been suggested. Thank you for your straight, hard-hitting approach. Keep it up. Our marriage has deepened tremendously, and we are stronger than we've ever been, even while working through the mess that this addiction has made. We're happy, loyal, and incredibly grateful D2Cers. We absolutely love these success stories. It's the reason why we do everything that we do in D2C, to help all of you find lasting recovery and healing. So come on over and join us in the D2C program. You can do it with a free 2-week trial, and you find that at daretoconnectnow.com.
Well, as we continue with this, right, and look at some of the problems with this, there are a lot of things that come from living a lifestyle where you are not living in and or are connected with and or expressing your own authenticity, your own needs, and those things are going either unvalidated or unacknowledged. And in relationships, sometimes these problems are obvious, but some of them are more subversive and we don't recognize them as a problem until they actually become one. So the first and foremost, we'll start with some of the more obvious here, as they definitely build anger. It's interesting as I look back over the years. I'm going to actually tie that with the first three: building anger, increasing resentment, and deepening distance. As I look back, there have been a number of partners that I've worked with in my 15 years of running, doing private practice work and working in this field, where I have worked with partners, and at the beginning of therapy, they have almost been insistent and very and resistant to the idea that their needs are being undercut or that they are not happy in the relationship, or and they have sometimes been resistant to or struggle to see some of this impact emotionally that this has had. Right, I'm still a strong, independent person, Steve. Like, this isn't, I love him just as much now as I did before, and I think to some degree that can be true, at least at first. But over time, these things do have a cumulative effect. And as I've worked with those partners and as change has not happened in relationships like that, where he's operating under a sense of enablement or whatever the case may be, inevitably what we see over time is those same partners they will start to talk about how they just feel unhappy in their marriage and they don't even know why. And as we kind of circle back and start examining this again, the dots start to connect.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Wow, maybe I am angrier than I thought. Maybe I am resentful. right? I've worked with partners who were in a place where they still loved their husbands very, very much, but found themselves vulnerable to an emotional or physical affair, for example. In that place of feeling all that love and affection for their partner, but that why were they vulnerable to that? It's not because they were promiscuous or being floozies or anything. They were far less happy in the relationship than they realized. And because their needs, wants weren't being validated, looked at, identified, connected with, etc., what did it take? All it took was one guy at work or at a place of business or whatever it is who started to acknowledge those things. And it started to fill a void that the partner never even knew was there.
Yeah.
I mean, really destructive stuff we have seen happen in relationships over the years with this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So,
And they can become so accustomed to not having a voice and so accustomed to, playing second person that they don't even realize a lot of times the damage that's being done is
absolutely.
just what it is.
Yes.
Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. And we look at this when you don't have a voice and it's not safe. It diminishes connection with certainly with others because you're not communicating your authentic self. You don't feel it's safe or you don't know how to be open about your wants and needs, but also your communication with yourself. I found that was true with me and a lot of those that I've worked with. It's not just I don't have a voice with others. I don't even have a healthy inner voice. Right. I found for a long time my inner self communication and dialogue was really awful, negative, shameful, dark. I would cut myself down in my own internal language. So it affects connection, all connection with not only others but ourselves as well. Yeah, crazy how
Yes.
it works.
Absolutely. Um, well, and kind of heaping on that, right? Let's talk about the dynamic that can oftentimes happen or become rooted in relationships. It's sadly it's human nature, kind of in a general sense, unless there is some sort of unless there's an awareness, not just around an issue, but around the consequences of said issue. Human nature has kind of proven out through history that change is either very slow in those situations if it happens at all.
Mm,
That would be true with the general population. When you are married to an addict, like Mark or myself, who's not in a successful long term place of recovery, uh, the addict mind thrives off of enablement. And operating in the shadows and not being called on its crap and a lack of accountability and all those kinds of things. Now, again, not that it's a partner's job to change an addict at all, but if needs are not being expressed or things aren't being shared, what isn't discussed or identified in the coupleship by a partner, when you're dealing with an addict who is not even successfully connecting with themselves and their own emotions, much less anybody else's, the chances of that changing or things improving in that scenario are I'd take my Vegas before I made that bet. I'll put it that way.
yeah,
That's it. They
yeah,
aren't good.
yeah. It's kind of an oxymoron. It's like a dog that chases his tail. I stay silent. I don't have a voice. This is how I stay safe. He's never going to listen to me anyway. So all kinds of stuff doesn't get expressed, which does what? It just deepens and worsens the whole scenario, and it won't change. In fact, it'll continue to spiral out of control, and it distorts a sense of self value. With a lack of worth or esteem deepens and goes darker, and the relationship remains out of balance, continues to get more out of balance, immature in many ways. The relationship doesn't mature, doesn't deepen. And what you
Hmm.
and I, Steve, see eventually, it's just not sustainable. You
Yes.
can't have a relationship where one person forever doesn't have a voice.
Mhm.
It's not sustainable.
Well, I want to talk about that immaturity piece for just a second because some people may hear that and be like, "Wait, what? You know, I've been married to my spouse for this." Maturity in a relationship is not necessarily determined by time, right? I mean, and this doesn't just play out, by the way, in intimate relationships like with a partner. This happens in other kinds of relationships. Think about the friends that you had when your younger years, right? And why those dropped off and how they dropped off. right? And now there are many reasons why that happens, right? Sometimes people move away, sometimes we just lose contact with people or whatever. But I can tell you one of the biggest key reasons is that the relationship wasn't ever able to mature. It wasn't able to make the translation from that surface level to something deeper,
Yeah.
right? It had a capstone to it.
Mm.
And one of those reasons, one of the things that gets in the way? It's this. Relationships, even in friendships, for example, they aren't sustainable. If we can't get to a point at some point in time where the relationship evolves into, we us being progressively more real with each other, relationships are always diminishing or increasing. And so if we're not increasing it, what's happening? It's going to languish, it's going to suffer, if we never can get past the surface, right, then how does the relationship stay? It stays kind of in that embryonic state.
Hmm.
Many of you can connect with being in dating relationships where this has happened, right? Have you ever seen one of those couples where it's like they're kind of frozen in time? It's cute at first. It's disturbing not too long after that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
So
um,
as we look at all this and kind of come to the conclusion of this podcast, we really need to look at, well, so how do I change this?
yes.
If I find that I don't have a voice, if I've been more silent, if I go along to get along, if I'm a people pleaser, if all these dysfunctional things have happened, how do I begin to change it? And one of the things, Steve, you and I talk about all the time in Dare to Connect is, and it may not seem intuitive to start here, but we always want to start with what is my own independent, sovereign worth? Is
Mm,
my worth dependent on this other person and what they think of me, how they treat me, how they're reacting or interacting with me? Does my worth come from that? Or does my worth come from something that is independent of that?
hmm
Because if my worth is coming from outside me, then I'm going to be willing to sacrifice my authenticity, my expression, my voice, and put up with things that I normally wouldn't because I'm so desperate to receive that worth from this outside person or source. But if I'm independently worthwhile, if it comes from deep inside, then I'm not going to be willing to put on the sacrificial altar a lot of stuff that I know that I would otherwise. Right? Powerful concept that this all has to start with. Where is my worth? Where does
Yeah.
it come from? Yeah.
Well, and what do I actually feel about myself versus how does that translate into actual action?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It always is interesting when I have this discussion with partners how oftentimes we find a variance between that. Well, Steve, I love myself. I care about myself. Okay, when's the last time you did something for yourself? Well, right. Well, gosh, I'm not sure. Right? Can you name the last time you? My wife. It's interesting. We have a really cool midwife. We just had our first baby a couple months ago, and I remember one of our appointments with this midwife. She kind of got out of the midwife thing and kind of just talked to my wife, and I really liked something she said. She said it's going to be crazy, it's going to be busy. This is a huge shift. She said, but you need to have 1 hour that's just you time every day.
Mm.
She said, I know that's asking a lot. I know that seems almost impossible, but she said that's absolutely critical. You have to be taking care of you if you're going to take care of the baby. And it really applies to here, right? Because how many of us again are quick to insist in conversation or otherwise that I love myself, I care about myself. When's the last time you really invested in yourself in some way?
Yeah.
When's the last time you sat down and did some of that basic self-care, practice some self-love, really took some time for you to develop something or cultivate something or whatever the case is? I think there are a lot of women who are going to hear this podcast, not just because of the addiction betrayal dynamic, but because of, frankly, the box that too many women have kind of been put in culturally, that find themselves in a place where they would advocate, yeah, I care about myself, I love myself, but they would be hard pressed to answer that question.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm being all things to everyone else. I have to, do it all, be it all, give
Because
it
unless
all.
you're actually practicing that, you have to ask yourself, what message am I actually internalizing?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, and I love, Steve, you talk about this concept called self-advocacy. How often do I advocate for myself? Am I cultivating my ability to and this is an important word, healthily, healthily express my authentic wants and needs.
Mhm.
How good am I at doing that? Just to letting you know what I want and need, and what does that mean to me, and finding my voice in that. How often do all the partners listening engage in those things instead of just staying silent, not speaking your truth until it builds and builds and builds, and then it just gushes out in anger or uncontrollable resentment, as opposed to regularly self-advocating, regularly speaking up for those things that are important to your worth and to your life and to your wants and your needs.
Mm.
Right? This is a big part of this self-expression. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that. I think that's so true. Let's press on here. So in this journey of changing this, right? After we've really had an honest conversation with ourselves, after we've really kind of identified where we really are in terms of not just acknowledging but practicing this self-worth and love, then we need to identify areas in which we're not actually cultivating or expressing our own authenticity and attached needs to others. So
Mm-hmm.
once we begin that internal work, now we have to start taking that externally and look at and say, okay, here's how I feel about myself. Now, how is that actually manifested with people? How much are my needs being translated into? How much am I clearly vocalizing these things with others? And for the scenarios or situations where I'm not, why am I not?
And,
And
and
let me, oh yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
I was just saying, and if I'm expressing these, if I'm not expressing these wants and needs, why not? And if I am, but they're still not being honored or attended to, then what are my boundaries? What are my boundaries to keep those authentic wants and needs safe and explored and pursued when others don't or won't meet them?
Yeah.
Right? Just this whole self advocacy place.
Well, because self advocacy is this is not self advocacy. Probably like most concepts that we do in recovery, it's not one of these concepts where you learn it and it's like, oh, that makes sense. I'm just doing this now. Putting this into practice is a skill set because there
Mhm.
are lots of valid fears, again, that get in the way of this, right? So, for example, I would say a lot of these fears, they pull back to this, to a risk of rejection in some area,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And we'll kind of come back to that in some of these further pieces, but it is important that I'm challenging whatever those things are in the way, whether it's fear or other things, by practicing this, right? So, for example, and I've done this exercise with clients. I've worked with clients who literally they came from such a damaged, for example, family of origin. Nobody ever taught them how to just basically express, here's what I want. That
Mhm.
sounds so weird to some of you, but for some of you, that's going to sound shockingly familiar. Like they never grew up in a household where they had Mark's upbringing, I think is one that's an example. Like I never there are people who just cannot recall a time when they ever were able to safely sit in an arena or anywhere and say, "This is what I want,"
Yeah. Yeah. This is
like
what I want.
ever.
Uh-uh.
And so practicing that, journaling about it, writing out letters, like literally practicing that is a great way to start that. Becoming comfortable with just the idea of actually using this voice. Think of it like you're a babe, like you're my newborn again, and like you've been or like think it maybe a better analogy. Think of it like you're learning a new language. You've spoken in these other tones all this time, but now you've got to learn a new one. Just because you're an expert speaker in another language doesn't mean you're not going to be a complete wingnut and newbie at it in this new area, right? So we start basic, we start small,
Yeah.
right? We find people that are safe enough with to begin expressing the most basic or smallest of needs with, to begin not just there's two pieces of this. It's the practicing the expression, but also challenging the fears as we do so, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's it's as we express those things with people who, for example, are safe, and we see that blood doesn't run out of the faucet because we expressed our needs to that person, right? The world didn't end. It builds our confidence in it. We
Yeah.
start to make progress, right?
And as we go through those safer environments, that we hope you all have support systems that are outside your primary relationship, for example, where you can do that. But so what about if we have a really toxic relationship, for example, with an addict? And it isn't safe to just go eyeball to eyeball to suddenly express my needs. Well, we start smaller. We start in more safe environments. Maybe you start to only express those in a therapist's office.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you only dare to start to express those in a written letter that is given to that person. Right? We can't make this giant leap into that really scary place of self-advocacy because sometimes it has not existed until now. So we have to make our way into it layer by layer. But
Mm-hmm.
the point is start making your way into it in whatever small or safe way you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and as we wrap up here, there are a couple things because we know that there's obviously this, now we're getting into this whole fear of rejection, right? And well, Steve, what if people reject my needs? What if they reject my wants? What if they won't hear me? Every situation is a little bit different, and especially when you're working with an addict, we recognize that there's a journey of progression here. But that being said, in the long term, I'm going to make two statements that when we're talking about relationships, if there's going to be, when it comes to really examining them for sustainability, Steve has learned these. This is clinical theory, but this has also been Steve's life experience, right? Remember, the first thing is any relationship worth pursuing is one that where the other is at least willing to hear, validate, and respect what you're saying, even if they don't agree.
Mm,
There has to be a place in relationships that are sustainable. There has to be a safe space for disagreement. Relationships that do not have a safe space for conflict will not last.
yeah.
They won't. You
Yeah.
have to have a place to disagree. You have to have a place to be you, and there has to be a venue where that can be expressed. And then the second piece is intimate relationships in which you cannot be yourself are unsustainable, and by definition, they do have an expiration date.
Mm,
That relationship is like that can of kidney beans on your shelf that you know you need to use and have meant to for like the last 5 years, but you know you just don't want to use the kidney beans. Well, it's going to be a use it if you don't move forward and do something, you're going to lose it. That relationship, it's going to end at some point poorly.
yeah.
And so you have to really that brings up all sorts of questions that each of us needs to ask about. Well, am I investing in the right relationships?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because this journey, what we've talked about today, guys, is it's the beginning of a bigger journey. Because when you start to really look at this, there are lots of relationships we find that as we do this deeper work, some of them do not last. There are relationships with family members, friends that maybe we've been hanging on to for way too long that could be trimmed or pruned off of the vine.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and if you're wanting to find your voice, if you're wanting to find out how to change things in your relationship because it's not in the place we've been talking about, come on over to Dare to Connect. One of the things we spend a lot of time on, four different sessions every week, is helping partners to find their voice, speak their truth, right? Lean in and start to develop self advocacy and live in authenticity. If you want to know how to do that and navigate that, come on over and learn it with us.
mhm.
Got a free 2-week trial. Try it out and come and participate. We'd love to have you over here.
Yep, absolutely. Well, we so appreciate you guys letting us into your hearts and homes as always here on the podcast. We are always ready to tackle more questions. Feel free to get those submitted at pbsepodcast.com. And we will, as we move into the first of, like I said, we aren't at our 3 year mark, but as we move into the next episode into year 4 here, we're excited to keep on this journey with you. And one day it'll be nice to have this podcast put out of a job. All that will take is for everyone's betrayal trauma to be resolved and, pornography and infidelity being abolished from the planet. No, these aren't small goals. These aren't big goals, right? No, nothing big.
Yeah, we
Oh,
will long for that day,
so we're not
actually.
going anywhere anytime soon. So we again appreciate you. Thank you for being here with us. And yeah, we will catch you in the next one.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Everything expressed on the PBSE podcast are the opinions of the hosts and the participants and is for informational and educational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered mental health therapy or as a substitute thereof. It is strongly recommended that you seek out the clinical guidance of an individual qualified mental health professional. If you're experiencing thoughts of suicide, self-harm, or a desire to harm others, please dial 911 or go to your nearest emergency room.